I guess we want to do some pointing. You said that this was homemaking.
Yeah, it said that this structure replaced the homemaking. And so if that's the homemaking, then that means that the high school would have been over to our right on the other side. And then the elementary school was behind the homemaking.
And did the wood shop have another outbuilding as well?
The elementary school was behind the high school, and then kind of between homemaking and the high school. The cafeteria was back there toward the back also.
And there wasn't any sort of a field or some kind of thing for the basketball court or gym?
We had a gym. There was a gym. But the gym would have been further on. Like the high school, say, was over to the right here. The gym was over on the other side and kind of back.
The school had quite a footprint. How many students do you think were there?
You know, I have no idea. Because it was first through the 12th grade.
Oh, it was? Okay.
Yeah. The elementary was first through the 8th.
Mm-hmm.
And then the high school was 9th through 12th.
So if siblings that were bused from a distance to go to high school and maybe their sibling was younger, would they have also gone to the elementary?
No.
They would have gone separate.
No, like in Emory, we had Sandflat.
Yeah.
So we didn't come here until 9th grade.
Yeah.
Now, it could have been some of the other communities. They came, you know, first through the 12th. But for us, it was just high school.
Mrs. Law was telling me that, and we can see it on the sign, that the year that she was attending her junior year, they weren't sure where they could go to high school because that hadn't been decided for many folks. Could you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, I guess maybe about the spring semester, 1965, we had heard that St. Paul was going to close. And Commerce was annexing Neelanville, so the students who lived out here were going to go to Commerce, but it had not been decided where we would go. And at the time, Raines High School, which is in Emory, had not accepted us. And my dad, who was the principal of the 1st through the 8th grade in Emory, he was seeing if we could get admitted to Miller Grove, which was out from Emory, and he was negotiating how they would bus us out to Miller Grove. But somewhere during that spring semester, Raines High School decided that they would allow us to come.
But you didn't know that till right before summer.
We didn't know that until just before graduation. So that spring semester, my classmates, you know, they were all talking about, you know, they were going to Commerce. And even when we had graduation, I can remember the superintendent from Commerce being at our graduation and everything. It wasn't my graduation, but it was St. Paul's graduation. So it was interesting.
That's an interesting time. I don't know if the ground is dry. Do you want us?
No. It was just the school. And I don't think we even had, I can't remember about a soda machine or anything like that. It could have been, but I don't think so. Actually, when we were going here, out on the highway, maybe down this way about a mile, was a service station. And the homemaking teacher and the shop teacher sometimes would go there, and they would let us ride with them, and we'd get snacks. And Mr. Williams, who was the shop teacher, was from Point. And he was one of my dad's best friends. And he used to let one of my cousins borrow his truck. And we would leave school and go to the store. And I know that was not legal at the time, but
Kids do what they do.
but we did. He would let us borrow his truck, and we'd go down to the store and we'd get snacks, and we'd come back and we'd eat them in the homemaking building.
Man, that sounds like Party Central.
Yeah, and then sometimes she would go to the store and she'd let some of us go with her, and we'd eat when we get back to the homemaking building.
There are photographs of like father-son banquets and things like that. Do you remember anything about that? And would that have been? Did you guys, as a homemaking class, prepare for events like that?
We had a fashion show.
Oh.
We had a fashion show annually, and I guess maybe the fall semester we would be cooking, and maybe the spring semester we would sew. And we would have a fashion show, and you would model whatever you made.
Mm-hmm. And during the school day, or would it be a separate event?
A separate event, it would be at night.
A big deal?
Mm-hmm. It was a very big deal.
That's very cool.
Yes.
I'm trying to visualize the other parts of your story too. So, so you had lunch across the street somewhere. Does it seem familiar? Where
I'm thinking maybe it's that house.
Okay.
Boulevard. My friend's dad, his name was Lee, last name was Lee, and they lived across the street. And that was so long ago, I don't remember anything about what the house looked like.
Mm-hmm.
And either the house is not here anymore, or that is the house. Mm-hmm. And we used to go across the street.
And what was she making for you guys? Do you remember?
No. I remember they would have a prune cake, and it was the first time I had ever heard of a prune cake, and I don't care for prunes, but the prune cake was very good. And I think maybe one of her oldest sisters used to bake the prune cake. And so that's what I remember most from going over to the Lee's house.
That's neat. You said that you went to a reunion a few years ago.
Yes.
And what was that like? Did a lot of folks come? And...
They do a St. Paul reunion. I think they had been doing it every several years, but I know they had one last year, and they're planning for one this year. Generally, I don't attend because for some reason I've had scheduling conflicts the past few summers, but this time I'm putting it on my schedule early. I do plan to attend this year.
That'll be neat. Because people are coming from all around for those things.
They do come from all around, and they have it at one of the hotels in Greenville, but then they plan something out here. If nothing, I guess, but just maybe a bus ride out here.
Yeah.
But they do come out here as a part of the reunion.
Speaking of buses, since the school was over there, the buses would have come in. I'm thinking about the pictures where the lot would have been, and it would have been just like a caliche kind of.
I don't think there was a lot per se.
Okay.
I don't think there was a lot. I think when the buses arrived, they parked somewhere, and it could be that the bus driver lived here in the community, so when he got back here, he might have parked the bus at his house.
Oh, okay.
I don't know, but I don't remember a lot of buses being parked. So I don't think there was ever a lot where there were buses parked.
And parents dropping kids off, or mostly the kids that weren't busing were walking, I guess. I don't remember that much.
I think when we got here, probably most of them were here, and so
We've been here for hours.
so I think probably most of them were getting off buses. So I don't think there were that many that we actually would see coming to school.
Do you guys have questions?
The restrooms were outside. Yes. The restrooms were outside, and they did not get indoor restrooms until shortly before I left. But when I came here, the restrooms were outside.
They were plumbed, were they?
Actually, what I learned in studying the Rosenwald schools, there was an outhouse floor plan also.
Okay, and that was just typical. Because I mean, I see a septic tank over there. This area I guess, was on a septic tank, or you guys wouldn't have known that. You guys didn't have any trouble with water in the home building.
I can't
Yeah.
remember.
Yeah.
But it would have been a septic tank because they wouldn't have had city water. So it would have been a septic tank.
They were completely self-sufficient.
Well, until desegregation, African American communities were self-sufficient. They had to be.
Yeah.
They had to be.
And that seemed like a sort of a radical move to push back. I mean, we keep our leadership, we keep our or just a move of necessity.
Yeah, well, that's another book.
Yeah.
That's another book. The effect on the African American communities because of desegregation. Because when the African American communities were segregated, they were self-sufficient. So if you were an African American, you lived in the same community with the doctor, with the lawyer, with the teacher, with the bus driver, with the janitor, with the cook. You all lived in the same community. But after desegregation, the attorney and the doctor and so forth, they moved. So that's another book.
Yeah, absolutely,
Yes.
absolutely. Do you remember what your supplies were like? It seems like Ms. Pennell was saying that at least at that time, as she's in the 50s, she was here. The supplies almost in the uniforms and everything came from the university pretty much. Do you know where they?
I don't really recall there being many supplies. I always had mine. So I never really thought about supplies that much. But I do know at Sandflat, when I was at Sandflat, and again, I knew a lot of these things because my dad was a principal.
Right.
But for example, when we got a library, the books were the books that had been discarded from Raines. And so when I was at St. Paul, I'm sure it was the same thing because the books that we had would always have lots of names in them. Mm-hmm. And like I said, when I took typing, none of the typewriters worked. At that time, the only uniforms that I recall, back then you had uniforms for physical education, and I don't remember, but I'm thinking we bought those.
Oh, okay.
Like maybe we were told that you get them at J.C. Penney or something.
These colors.
And it was a navy one-piece outfit that you had for physical education.
As flattering as could be.
And I played on the basketball team, and we had uniforms for basketball. But I think those probably were just hand-me-down that had been handed down from year to year. We didn't get new ones. I know that.
Yeah. So you played basketball too, and I know that you said that you traveled the state for homemaking competitions. Were those? I guess there was just a few of you guys going to these, or just you?
Usually there would be three or four.
Okay.
And for example, I can remember going to a conference at Texas College in Tyler, and what we would do, we would stay in the dorms with the college students. And so that was very interesting. And the 3 years that I was at St. Paul, I went to the state meetings at Prairie View. And the same thing, you stayed in the dorms with the college students.
That'll make you want to go.
Yeah, it did. It did.
Yeah. Okay. So hello. Welcome to the final speaker in Black History Month, our grand finale. We're going to start with a video of Gwen Law's African American Museum, and because you're going to see a lot of the themes that we've been discussing up here in this museum, and it's well worth a visit. And we'll also hear from Miss Law. She's got, you should have a flyer. This is her book about her life, growing up in Rains County and going to school in Neelanville. We spoke some about that, and then coming back and experiencing a number of firsts, both in these schools and then on this campus, and then later in the Dallas Independent School District, where she spent her 40-year career as a teacher, recently retired. So I'd like to start with this video and then ask Mrs. Law to come up and visit with us. I'll have some questions. I hope you'll have some questions. I know you'll have some questions, and I know you'll enjoy it. We'll start here.
Good afternoon. This is the first time that I have presented or spoken to anyone after viewing this. Actually, it's the first time I've seen it, except for on my phone, because this was filmed for Channel 7 out of Tyler, and whatever the station is for Lufkin and for Nacogdoches. And so they showed it as a part of what they call Proud of East Texas, and so it was a part of their African American history programs. So they showed it last week. And I had only seen it on my phone, so it was interesting for me to see it as well. I think what we're going to do is talk mostly in response to your questions, but just to tell you a little about who I am and how I came about writing my book. I'm from Emory, Texas, and about, I guess, 30 years ago, when my father was still living, he had a list of his father's sisters and brothers' names, and they were in his aunt's Bible. And a long time ago, that's how people kept up with birthdays and that sort of thing. So I saw this list, and I was somewhat curious because I didn't know who all these people were. And then several years after he died, I found that list again, and I decided that using those names, I was going to write my family's history. So I started writing my family's history based on what I know or what I knew. And what do you know most about? You know most about you. So in writing my family's history, I started out with writing about me. And as I did the genealogical search, I also started getting a lot of feedback that maybe I should do more than just write the genealogy because of the time that I grew up. And what I mean by that is I was one of those that was fortunate enough to live in a totally segregated environment, but then to be the beneficiary of being among the first to go to the newly desegregated schools. And From that point on, my life consisted of a lot of firsts. Most organizations were still desegregated. Most institutions were still desegregated. Still segregated. And so I was among the first to graduate from the high school in my hometown. I attended and graduated from East Texas State University. And at that time, it was still a time of a lot of firsts, even though the school had been accepting African Americans for several years. There were still a lot of areas that the African Americans had not participated in. And I graduated from East Texas A&M Commerce, and then I taught in Dallas. The first year that I taught in Dallas, in the Dallas Independent School District, just happened to be the first year that they had total desegregation of the schools. So again, it was like I continued to be a part of a lot of firsts. And recently, I retired from the Dallas Independent School District, and now I like to think of myself as an author rather than a teacher. So I'm open to ask any questions that you might have.
Okay.
I know you talked about your father and the Sand Flat School. Can you kind of describe where Sand Flat is, what it was like? Because I know a lot of these students would not have had any idea about what that was like.
In the video, my husband referred to the Rosenwald School. Back during the time of segregated schools, the Rosenwald schools were the schools that were for African Americans, and they were usually in the rural South. And they were called Rosenwald schools because the president at Sears Roebuck at the time, whose name was Julius Rosenwald, he put up money for these schools to be built to educate African American children. And as for Sand Flat is concerned, in 1922, the school was built in Sand Flat with funds from the Julius Rosenwald Fund, 1/3 from the county, and then the other third was from the African American community itself. This school is the school that my parents attended and then I attended. And if you were to look back on the time that I was at Sand Flat School, there really wasn't a lot of difference in the time that I was there and the time that my parents were there. At that time, the schools were totally segregated. In fact, the community was pretty much self-sustaining. Basically, everything that we did was in our community. The school, the church, the cemeteries, basically whatever we did was in the community. My father was the principal, and in the video I mentioned that usually at that particular time, principal meant bus driver, custodian, coach, cook, all of those things, and that was actually correct. I can remember that my father did drive the bus. My father was the coach. And he was also the teacher for the upper grades. And when the schools were totally desegregated, he was hired as the junior high principal at Raines High School. At that time, most of his counterparts or his contemporaries did not get jobs. So that was a time that, although African American children benefited in a lot of ways, there were also a lot of losses, I guess you could say, because many of our teachers did not get hired once the schools were desegregated.
Where would, you've got a school full then, and many schools full of very well-educated African Americans as we're beginning to desegregate the South. Where did these folks in your community, where did they end up working? Did they become teachers again at another point, or they just took jobs where they could?
Most of the time in my community, once you were educated, you didn't live in the community anymore because there were no jobs. I guess maybe looking at older cousins, older aunts, when they graduated and got their degrees, for the most part, they moved to Dallas.
On the video, you said that you're part of the fourth generation educator. So your father, your grandparents as well?
Yes, when I started doing my genealogical research, generally when you start writing your history, most of what you have is based on what you've heard. And so there was always this discussion that my dad's grandfather, which would have been my great-grandfather, was put in jail for being married to a white woman. And so I had heard that, but, I didn't know anything about it. Well, when I started doing the research, I found that back in the late 1900s, my great-grandmother had been the first African-American teacher in Emory. And then in looking at her pictures, I could see why that they had said or had mentioned that she had been white. But in my family, they always said, well, she was Indian. And then when I looked at the county treasurer's records, the county treasurer's records showed that my great-grandmother was paid for teaching in the late 1800s and in the early 1900s. And it didn't show that her husband had. And so I don't know what the difference was, but supposedly both of them were teachers, but the records only showed that she got paid. So I'm thinking maybe perhaps they did think that she was white, the reason she got paid and he didn't.
Yes.
When you were living in Raines County under Jim Crow, you said that there was segregation of the whites and blacks. What were the avenues of communication between the black community and the white community? And were there any communications?
Well, there was communication. There was communication in different ways. I can remember when I was a child, there was a man who owned a service station. And his service station was kind of like where all of the gossip and the news went or was gathered. And I can remember, as a small child, I can remember whenever you'd stop at that service station, and back then that was when you had full service so you didn't get out. And I can remember he would come to the window and he always would talk to my dad about what was going on in the community. And I can remember when it was decided that the schools were going to be desegregated, I can remember how he would come and talk to my dad about it. And on the other hand, most of the girls my age, I don't think any of us had white friends. But the boys always did. A lot of them played ball together and visited each other, but the girls never did.
Where?
I believe we started high school with St. Paul,
Yes.
and then, of course, finished Wayne. What's the difference between going to a parochial school and a public school? Because St. Paul's a parochial.
No,
Huh?
no,
Wasn't parochial?
no, just the name. Just sounds like it.
Okay. I knew it was second, but I was believing it was St. Paul Episcopal School.
No,
In that case, I'm wrong.
no. St. Paul was another Rosenwald school just like Sandflat.
Yeah.
Tell us the bus ride that you took from Emory to St. Paul and Neelanville every morning, and then the ride back in the evening. And then mention you stopped at Lone Oak to get candy and soft drinks at the gas station.
Okay. How many of you are from Texas? Okay, then maybe this will be somewhat clear to you. Maybe you kind of know where these places are. St. Paul was in the community that is now Neelanville. And Neelanville is just outside of Commerce. When I went to St. Paul, we didn't think of it as even relating to Commerce. The mailing address was Greenville, so we always said we went to school just outside of Greenville. Well, there were a lot of communities like the community that I lived in that did not have a school for African Americans. So St. Paul sent buses that would pick up children all the way from Greenville to Emory. And so we were like at the end of the line. A typical day at St. Paul, you'd get up and you'd catch the bus about 7:15 in the morning. And we would leave Emory and we would go to Point. Well, where the African Americans lived in Point was out in a community called Richland. So the bus would go out to Richland. Then we would leave Richland and we'd go to Lone Oak. Well, when you get to Lone Oak, where the African Americans lived, at that time they called it the Nation. It was out in the country. So the bus would pick them up out in the country. Then we'd come back to the highway. We'd come toward Greenville, but then we would get off the highway again, and somehow we would come out in Cumbie and come around through Campbell. And then the highways were not as they are now, but somehow we would end up at St. Paul, which is just outside of Commerce. Well, coming to school was very different from leaving school. If we came to school and as a part of that bus, the bus ride itself probably was about an hour and a half or 2 hours. So we would get to school maybe 9 o'clock, 8:30, 9 o'clock. I'm really not sure what time. But if there was ever any trouble with the bus, it wasn't unusual to get to school at noon. Well, if you were a student, you didn't really have a problem with getting to school late. You know, if you got to school late, if it was noon, you just got to school and you went on to lunch. Or you went to whatever class was going on at that time. So getting to school late was not a real problem. The real problem came in coming home from school. Now, when we came home in the afternoon, when we would get to Lone Oak, that was kind of like our rest stop. And there was a service station that had drinks and snacks. So we would get off the bus in Lone Oak. Then the bus driver would go out and deliver the kids who lived out in the area that was called the Nation. Then when he came back, we'd get back on the bus and return home. Well, if we had a problem with the bus, that meant that another bus would have to come get us after making the same kind of rounds. So we might get home like at 7 o'clock at night. Well, like I said, you might not be very upset if you got to school at noon. But when that being delayed was on the other end, it wasn't the same. And back then, there were no cell phones. So if the bus had a problem, you couldn't call home and say that you're going to be running late. If the bus had a problem, if it was mechanical, bus driver might get off and see if he could fix it. If he couldn't, he might get off and he would have to walk to maybe find a payphone, or if it was out in the country somewhere, he might have to walk to somebody's house to call for help. There were no dispatchers or cell phones or anything like that. So the drive, particularly in the wintertime, if it was cold, we might be stuck on the bus out in the middle of nowhere for hours. Or in the summertime when it was really hot. So that was kind of a typical bus ride.
I have a question. Can you describe what the atmosphere was like inside the school at St. Paul? So, for example, what electricity, running water, books, supplies, things like that?
Well, first of all, I want to say we had good teachers, and because I was a teacher, I always told my students whenever they talked about schools, if you had a book and you could read, there was no excuse not to know. So at St. Paul, we had good teachers. But beyond that, we didn't have very much. When I went to St. Paul in 1962, they still had outdoor restrooms. The building was in very bad shape. The buildings were in very bad shape. In the wintertime, it would actually be too cold to have class, and we could leave and go to wherever there was a warm classroom. So there were a lot of days we really didn't have class. We went where we could stay warm.
You had mentioned that you were there for 3 years, and your final year was the year that desegregation hit, and St. Paul was being absorbed into commerce, and so the people who, African-American students who were residing in commerce were set for high school, but everybody else was not sure. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. My junior year, there started to be rumors that St. Paul was going to close. And we had heard that Commerce was going to take St. Paul into its district. So those students who lived out in the Neelanville community, they knew that they were going to be going to Commerce the next year. But those of us that came from Emory, from Point, Lone Oak, we really didn't know where we were going to be the next year. And it was near time for school to be out for the summer. And we still didn't know where we were going to go. And by my father being the principal in Emory at Sand Flat, he was the one that had made it possible for students in Emory to go to St. Paul in the first place, which had been years before. So Raines High School, which is the high school in Emory, had not said that they were going to accept us. And so my father was talking to the superintendent in Miller Grove about our going to school in Miller Grove. And so we were thinking that possibly that's where we would be the next year. But I guess right before school was out for the summer, we learned that Raines was going to accept us and we would be going to school there.
Could you say that your dad was responsible for helping open the doors to students in your community to St. Paul's for access to high school? Longtime principal of grades 1 through 8 and in that community. Can you talk a little bit about that process? Because without it, they would not have had access to high school.
No, for years in Emory, if you were African American, when you finished the 10th grade, and I'm not sure when it went from 10th to 8th, at some point they went to 10th grade, but during my lifetime it was to 8th grade. When you finished the 8th grade, that was the end of your education unless you moved to go to high school. And so the reason my dad had been able to get a college education is he went to the military, and when he came from the military, he went to college on the GI Bill. But he never finished high school because, like I said, at that time there was no high school in Emory. But he managed to go after getting out of the military without completing high school. And somehow he worked with St. Paul, and they had an agreement that they would send buses to Emory. And so that was when the students in Emory were allowed to get a high school education by catching the bus to St. Paul.
May I ask a question? Like, if the school teacher teach the difference between white and brown?
Yeah, so he's asking different methods for teaching in a segregated school versus a white school, because I guess your dad would have been trained in teaching segregated schools.
Well, let me tell you what I saw as being the difference. You know, there are always two sides to everything. So once the schools were desegregated, it was kind of like we were all supposed to be happy to be there. It wasn't exactly like that. I didn't have a problem being there, but there was a lot of discrimination, but it was kind of disguised, but we recognized it. And one of the things that I saw as a problem immediately, we came from St. Paul. At St. Paul, they had letter grades. Excuse me. At St. Paul, they had, at St. Paul, they had letter grades. So when I went to Raines, they had number grades. Well, you could manipulate changing the grades very easily. Fortunately, I was an A student. Well, an A could mean that I was a 100 or that I was a 90. You see what I'm saying? So when I came from St. Paul with all A's and they took my transcript, they had a number that they gave you if you had an A, They had a number that they gave you if you had an A minus. And so that immediately changed my grade point. And so that was one of the first things that I saw that I didn't like about changing the schools. And then the other thing was, when you are in senior English, and the senior English teacher also taught junior English, she assumed that you knew what she was talking about because she had taught you that last year. And so that was another way that I saw that it was different. So there were several things that were different, and it wasn't always positive.
Interesting subtleties on the grade point average, because I guess in the end that means that no matter how well you were doing in another school, there was not going to be an African-American valedictorian at Brains High School.
Right, right. As it turned out, I graduated third in my class, and the Emory paper, which is the Rains County Leader, every year nearing graduation, they put the valedictorian and the salutatorian. They put their pictures in the paper, you know, the little write-up. That year, they put the first three. Well, to me, that said, okay, we know that you might have been the salutatorian, but we're not going to let you go that far, but we will let you be three. So, personally, I've always felt that I might have had the best grade point, but I wasn't the smartest, and I wasn't the most deserving. So it really was okay for them to put me as the third. But I always wondered, because my grades were, you know, manipulated.
I'm curious, you had said that ET had been desegregated for some time when you arrived, but there were some areas that weren't quite open to African Americans. So could you talk a little bit about your experience here, and also your decision to come to ET?
Well, I'll answer the last one first. My decision to come to ET was economical. The year that I came to ET, I had a brother that came to ET. And my father could afford ET for both of us. So that was the decision to come to ET. Some of the things that were different, when I came to ET, there were no African American sororities and fraternities. And so, personally, I always saw myself as not being sorority material, but because there were no sororities, I worked to get African American sororities on campus. And at that time, I don't know how many of you are in sororities or fraternities, but at that time, whenever you get a sorority on campus, you had to go through the Panhellenic, whatever that organization, Panhellenic Council, and you had to meet the same requirements as the other organizations. And so the organization that we founded on campus, its standards were much higher than the Panhellenic Council's requirements. So in some ways, we had to lower our standards in order to be a sorority on this campus. But the other thing is, young ladies go through rush on campus. And so because we were organizing a sorority, we had to go through rush. Now we knew that that was just going through the motions. We knew that we were not going to be invited to be in any of those sororities. But we still had to go through the same motion. You know, you had to get dressed and go to the teas or whatever at the different sorority houses. So that was one thing. We didn't have sororities and fraternities. And then another thing, the school newspaper, it used to feature like a beauty of the week type thing. I never believed in that kind of stuff either, but I was the first African American to be featured in that. The Miss E.T. pageant, they had never had African Americans in that. And I was in that for the first time for African Americans. So even though the school had been desegregated several years before I came, it was still segregated in many ways. Well, I always say he's the historian, and I speak in round figures. I don't generally use exact numbers, but Rains County was founded, seemed like maybe 1870, something like that. And my family goes back to then. But Rains County was carved out of Wood County and Hopkins County. And so my family is actually from Wood County. And so they were in Rains County when Rains County was founded.
What were some of the other interesting details that you learned about your family in this research that may match up or disrupt stories that you heard during growing up?
Well, I must say that the most that I have learned that has been surprising has been after the publishing of my book. When I started to do my research, one of the things about my family, the Macmillans, we like to brag that we've been having a family reunion since the 1950s, and that was before Roots. So we have had a family reunion annually since the 50s. And so when I first started doing my research, I thought, well, the best way to get my information is at the family reunion. So at the family reunion, I had typed up just kind of an introduction to my family's history, my immediate family. And I started with my great-grandparents, then my grandparents, and on down. And I wrote it up in a way that I wanted to use as an example for the other family members. Well, I gave these handouts at the reunion for about 3 years and asked family members to give me the information back. I never got any information back. So what I started doing was just writing what I knew, and then some of my older relatives, I would just ask questions and I would fill in the blanks. What I didn't realize was that because of the internet, because of Facebook, a lot of things, a lot of information, I guess I should say, a lot of the blanks that I had in my writing have all been filled because of the internet. Once I was writing my book, I didn't get very much help. Once the book was published, and it's surprising to me. I had my book published because I wanted my family to know its history. My grandson, I wanted my grandson to be able to read the book and to remember that we went to the library and did research for this information. But once the book was published, I started getting phone calls and emails from all over the country. And so I have found out more about family members that were just brief references. I knew that I had a relative that taught at Meharry University, a Dr. Julius McMillan, and I knew that I had a relative that was the registrar at Prairie View at one time. I knew that in Dallas there was a sanitarium that was the McMillan Sanitarium, but I didn't know these people. I just knew that they were supposed to be relatives. Well, because of my book and because of the internet, I have conversations daily through either email or Facebook with McMillans from Tennessee, Denver, Colorado, California, several different places in California, and Chicago, and they have more specific information on all of these people that I just knew the names of. So I've been able to, I always knew who my great-grandparents were, but now I know the names of my great-great-grandparents on my mother's side and on my father's side. So I was able to go back a little further than I knew.
Maybe talk a little bit more about the Rosenwald School. Maybe tell us a little bit about the school itself, what it was like when it was set up, and why restoring it might be an important thing for us to commit to.
I guess it's been about 8 or 9 years ago now. The National Trust for Historic Preservation, they do a list every year about the most endangered. And so several years back, the Rosenwald Schools was on its most endangered list. And the reason they are considered endangered, in Texas, there were 527 Rosenwald schools. Of that 527, only about 30 are still standing. Sand Flat is one of the 30. And most of the buildings throughout the South are now gone, or if they are still around, they are either community centers, some are even houses, some are barns. So there's been a push to preserve and restore these schools. So since we have one in Rains County, and we know that these schools are valued nationally, not just locally, we want to preserve ours. However, we've had a lot of people that have expressed interest. A lot of people think it's a good idea, but when it all boils down, it comes to the money, and we have not been able to raise enough money to restore the school. But we're starting to do little things in preparation for doing a restoration. And we started out by having a site plan, and that was what you saw on the video. So we have had the architect do the site plan and everything. And hopefully at some point we will be able to restore the school.
Could you talk a little bit about the layout of the school? They just got a flash of it, and how it was used in your day and in your father's time, and also what might be what it might be used for once it's restored.
We're kind of torn between what we would really like to see it used at, if it was restored. Ideally, we would like to move our museum to the school. And that would be the perfect place because most of our history that we have centers around the Rosenwald schools. So that's one option. And the other option is to make it a community center. The first option we like, but because we're located in downtown Emory, you have automatic security. You don't have to worry about an alarm system and that sort of thing because we're right there just off the courthouse square. And so if we relocated and moved to where the school is, we would also be out of the line of traffic. Now, it's kind of hard to come downtown Emory and not pass the museum.
You were down from the library, that's nice.
Yes.
I wanted to follow up on Jeremy's question, some of the conversations we had earlier today. You told us earlier that you'd always envisioned that you would go to one of the historically Black colleges that your relatives had. Can you talk us a little bit about your early thoughts on that and maybe your connections to Prairie View and others?
Yes. Well, when I was growing up, there was never any doubt as to whether I was going to go to college. It was just where. And my dad had gone to Texas College in Tyler. Most of my relatives from Emory had gone to Texas College. So I didn't want to go to Texas College. And at the time that I was graduating from high school, most of my friends from St. Paul were going to Prairie View. So I wanted to go to Prairie View. And I had just kind of had my mind set on going to Prairie View. And as I said earlier, when I look back on it, I think it was kind of unusual, but you know how athletes are recruited and the recruiters come and talk to the parents? When I graduated from high school, recruiters came from Henderson County Junior College to my house. At that time it was Henderson County, now it's Trinity Valley. So they came to my house and my dad was sold. So I went to Henderson County. So all of my plans for going elsewhere were somewhat ended with that visit.
You also learned typing in elementary school. Can you tell us a little bit about that? And then I guess on through working in the office of St. Paul's?
Yes. When I went to school at San Flat, unlike when my dad became the junior high principal at Raines, he didn't have a secretary at San Flat. And so early on, I learned how to type. My first grade teacher taught first through the third grade. She helped me learn to type as well as my dad. And so by the time I finished 8th grade, I really could type pretty well. And I also had a very nice handwriting. And so when my dad needed work done, like secretarial work, I worked in the office. When graduation came, I wrote out the diplomas. I wrote out the perfect attendance certificates. When I was in 7th and 8th grade, I did that. I did all of that. And so once I went to high school, I used to work in the office a lot. And it wasn't until just a few years ago my mother heard me telling that. And I was telling how when the secretary was behind, I would work in the office sometimes for several days in a row. And I particularly remember once we were having a Southern Association visit. If you have not taught, you might not have paid attention to those, but when the schools are, when they are monitored for renewing the accreditation, you have those Southern Association visit, and it's a lot of reports. Well, I remember typing those when I was in high school. I remember helping the secretary. So.
Yeah, and you would eventually become a business teacher and then teach computers, yet you did not take business classes until your final year of high school. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, my senior year, I went to Raines High School, and I had the most wonderful teacher, Miss Shiflett. And she was the typing teacher, and she was the shorthand teacher. I didn't even know what shorthand was, but I took shorthand and I took typing under Miss Shiflett. And I did very well, and I really enjoyed being in Miss Shiflett's class. So when I went to college, I majored in business. But even though I majored in business, I still didn't want to be a teacher. But I ended up being a business teacher.
And there was part of the reason for not taking business classes at St. Paul is some equipment issues.
When I took typing at St. Paul, I already knew how to type, but typing was taught in the library, and some of you young people may not have ever even seen a manual typewriter, but we only had about 6 typewriters, and it was in the library. So it was more like a study hall, but it was called typing, but none of the typewriters worked.
So I have in queue a couple of questions. One is a really practical, excellent one. How much is necessary to restore the Rosenwald School, and what's the target, and what's the distance between what you have and what you need? How can these young folk help?
Those are some hard questions. Ideally, if we had a couple of $100,000, we could be well on our way to doing what we would like to do. However, some of the things that we need to do first, we've had the site plan done. There would need to be work done on the parking lot, or a parking lot would need to be developed. The building needs to be leveled. That has to be first. So some of these things will have to be done on a step-by-step basis like that. So there needs to be landscaping, and there needs to be the leveling of the building. So those are some of the immediate things that would need to be done. Around 2005, when we first started wanting to get this done, we took a picture of the building, and it's the picture that's on the cover of my book. But about a year ago, the front of the building, the part over the porch, fell. So the longer we wait to get work done, it's going to be the more extensive the work will need to be.
And they're all ready. That's just fine. The other question over here was, can you talk a little bit about your studies in African American history, African American literature, and so forth? I understand your dad was instrumental in making sure that you had a solid foundation in that.
Well, first of all, I never really heard the term African American history probably until I was here. And that wasn't because there were any classes, but it was during a time that there were a lot of African American movements to get certain things on campus. So I did hear of African American history. At the school where I just retired, they had an African American history class last year. That was a pilot program. That was the first time. So I have not had any formal African American history classes. However, in my family, growing up in our household, you learned African American history. The first book that I ever read was Up From Slavery. And I think I must have been in the 3rd or the 4th grade. We always had Jet magazine, Ebony magazine. We had the Post-Tribune newspaper from Dallas. And then we had a newspaper called Grit. And I just thought of that today, so I really can't remember much about that paper. But I remember we had a paper called Grit. And then we had another newspaper that was called the Kansas City Call. And it was kind of a national African American newspaper, but it was out of Kansas City. And so all my life I've always been exposed to reading about African Americans. And also, my dad was a member of the NAACP a long time before there were any local chapters anywhere for him to be a member.
Can you tell us what you and your family did for entertainment when you were growing up in Emory, in San Flat? Movies, go out for dinner?
Okay. You know, once you get older and you look back on it, you have a different appreciation for things than you had at the time. When I grew up in Emory, that was, you know, I've already said that was during segregation. Well, my dad did not like for us to go anywhere that we were not treated like he thought we should be treated. So he didn't let us go to the restaurants in Emory, because if you went to the restaurant in Emory, you had to go to the back. So he didn't let us do that. So probably maybe a couple of times a month, he would take the family out to eat and to a movie. And we used to go to Dallas to go out to eat. And are any of you from Dallas? You know about the Good Luck hamburgers? Well, back when I was a child, there weren't a lot of restaurants that you could go in, but you could go to Dallas and you had Good Luck hamburgers, so we would go to Good Luck. And then if my dad wanted to take my mother out to dinner and not take us, he would go to the Green Parrot. You ever heard of the Green Parrot? Know where the Forest Theater was?
What theater?
Mm-hmm. It's on the corner of Martin Luther King and Central. No, you know where it is. Okay, that used to be a movie theater. So we used to go to the movies there. And we went to the movies there because you didn't have to go upstairs. It was an African American theater. We would go to the Forest Theater, or we would go to the State Theater. And these were African-American theaters. And so that's generally what it consisted of. We would have.
They may not know about seating in white theaters.
Yes. When I was little, if you went to a movie, African Americans had to go up in the balcony. If you went to a restaurant, you had to go to the back. Well, my father wouldn't let us do that. So we would always go to Dallas if we went out. Back then, if you traveled, you couldn't stay in the motels. You couldn't stop along the way and eat at the restaurants. So if we went on a long trip, for example, we used to go to Oklahoma sometime, and we had relatives that lived way out West Texas. We would take food, we'd stop and eat in a roadside park, like a picnic, and that way we wouldn't be subjected to being turned down.
I can hardly believe it, but it is 3:10, and I know that several like to have questions they're not ready to ask out in front of everybody. So I urge you guys to hang out and maybe visit with Mrs. Law for a bit, have some cookies and stuff, and then we'll let her get back to Dallas. Thank you guys.
Thank you.